today I'm not going to be interviewing because I'm very, I feel like I'm out of my depth here. So we have invited Sharbani to host the show today. Sharbani is a student of Arundhati ma'am, and she's also an HWR alum. She lives and works in Mumbai and is currently struggling to juggle poetry with family work and walking the dog. So welcome, Sharbani. Thank you for agreeing to do this for us. And let me also take this moment to introduce Arundhati ma'am to, I don't know if anybody is unfamiliar with her, just in case. Arundhathi Subramaniam is a leading Indian poet and author of 14 books of poetry and prose. Her recent work includes the Penguin Anthology of Female Mystic Poetry, Wild Women, a prose work on contemporary women on spiritual journeys, women who were only themselves. A new book of poems is forthcoming next year. Described as one of the finest poets writing in India today by Hindu and a unique poet of our times in a league all by herself by Indian literature in 2021. She is a recipient of Sahitya Akademi Award for Poetry in 2020. Her awards include Mahakavi Kanhaiyalal Sethia Awards for Poetry, the inaugural Khushwant Singh Poetry Prize, the Il Ceppo Prize in Italy, the Raza Award for Poetry, the Mystic Kalinga Award, the Charles Wallace and Homi Bhabha Fellowships, among others. Widely translated and anthologized, her book, When God is a Traveler, was the season choice of the Poetry Book Society shortlisted for the T.S. Eliot Prize. She has been active as curator, performing arts critic, and poetry editor of the India domain of Poetry International Web. She divides her time between Mumbai, Chennai, and New York. And right now she is in New York and still very kindly agreed to give us her time early in the morning. So thank you so much, Arundhati ma'am. Welcome. And Sharbani, if you can just take over from here.
So, hi Arundhati, an absolute privilege and honor to be having a conversation with you. And I remember you from our lovely walks and our classes at the Himalayan Writing Retreat. So
Thank you,
first wanted to ask you.
Let me just say I'm delighted to be in conversation with you. So it's been a while. It's been, what, 2 years now? But
2 years, yes.
It feels good to be seeing you again and look forward to this.
And I do hope I can catch you this time in November at the Himalayan Writing Retreat again.
Mm-hmm. I hope you'll be there.
Yes.
Now that you've told me the dates, thank you for reminding me of the dates. I'll try and make sure I'm there too.
Right. So, Arundhati, poetry is not a biography, nor is it fiction or anything that can be defined. So, how would you define poetry in a nutshell, if it's even possible?
You know, as I often say, the good thing about poetry is no one really needs you to define it because everyone has their own gut level understanding of what it is and what it isn't. And I think for me, it's meant different things at different times, Sharbani, but I'd say right now, or for this morning, I would choose to define it as a kind of verbal dance between gravity and grace. That is, between the terrestrial and the aerial. It's language that's always trying to leap off a page. That to me is the lyric poem. It's as tethered to the page as it is language that's trained to leap off it. That creative tension is an integral part of it.
Wow. Thank you. Wonderfully put. I'd like to ask you, for you, was poetry a calling? Was it an epiphany that you had that led you to write poems?
And I think it just started with an excitement about language, language that is playful, which is how I think most of us are introduced to poetry as children. It's a place where language is dynamic, it's kinetic. It's very difficult not to be excited about poems as a child. It's only later that we develop, I think, a lot of our misgivings about poetry. So I think for me, that's what it was. And it was language that was capable of dancing. Dance fascinates me, poetry fascinates me, and I don't think that that's a coincidence. So I'd say that's how it started. So it's not an
Right.
epiphany, but different things at different times. For most of us, I suspect in our teens, poetry is a very urgent form of self-expression, and that's important too. So I don't know if you need an epiphany for that, but you certainly need to feel intensely and you need to love language. To me, those are the prerequisites. But the motivations to write keep changing. Why you write keeps changing. Self-expression is wonderfully important, but for me, I'm not sure that that's the overriding motivation today. Today, for me, it is much more about how do you create a line that shivers on the page? To me, how
Wow.
you fine-tune a line to make it pulsate. To me, that excites me.
Wonderful. Um, so what are the early influences that shaped you as a poet, that shaped such absolutely beautiful thoughts about poetry? How were you shaped as a poet through your early influences?
I think the influences were perhaps many more than I can enumerate. One of it, the first is, of course, just a joy about being around poems, and therefore you go and make sure you read more poems. So it was about hanging out with lots and lots of dead poets, really. That helped. And later, I think I became more aware of the fact that growing up in Bombay, which is what it was at the time, I was actually in a city of poets. There was Nissim Ezekiel, there was Arun Kolatkar, there was Adil Jasawala, Eunice D'Souza, Gieve Patel, so many poets, Dilip Chitre. So I wasn't aware of it at the time, but subconsciously there was a sense of legacy that I wasn't, that must have shaped me on some level. And still later, there was the writers group, the poetry circle that a bunch of us were a part of. I think all of that played a role in shaping my poetics. I think the most important thing about the poetry circle was that it was a place where we didn't discuss ideology, we didn't discuss content. So a lot of the time in universities, the conversations were around heated ideological debate. But at the poetry circle, we made sure we discussed form, we discussed craft. I think all of that today, looking back, I think shaped the poet that I became. But influences, I'd say because I changed, the influences changed. So while I grew up on an absolutely omnivorous diet of Zen poetry and the modern poets, from Wallace Stevens to um, Rilke and T.S. Eliot and so on, much later in my life, when my own spiritual journey, or just when existential questions became very urgent, it was the bhakti poets that I turned to. And I found that sacred poetry, and this is true of all kinds of sacred poetry, though I happened to focus on bhakti literature, I found that it was much more startling and unorthodox and irreverent and passionate and intense than I had ever dreamt. I just saw it as a lot of goody-goody poetry growing up. But some of it actually rescued me when I needed it. So that would be, if that's an influence, I would say, I'm not sure I'd count it as an influence, I'd count it as sanctuary. It became sanctuary for me.
I see. I see.
And among the Bombay poets, did I omit Nissim Ezekiel? I mean, I can't, that's a brave omission if I did,
No,
because
you mentioned.
I mentioned him. He was a mentor poet in many ways to some of us.
I see. I see. Okay. You mentioned Nissim Ezekiel, you mentioned Dilip Chitre, Arun Kolatkar, uh, then Eunice D'Souza.
Who was actually a professor of mine at one point in Xavier's. Yeah.
I see. Oh, wonderful. Wonderful. So often, poets are inspired to write, Wordsworth, which is nature walks, and all poetry seems to come from a wellspring of inspiration. So how does one combine, to our writers out there, how does one combine the discipline of sitting down and writing with this inspiration that comes?
I think the two go together. We often tend to separate these as if craft has nothing to do with creativity, when in fact the two are integrally linked. So the inspiration may for you or me be one particular moment, and there is a magic in that, and that must be honored. But there is also the sheer joy and the sheer sensual pleasure of sitting down with a poem in progress. When you're hanging around words, scraping the varnish off a word, fine-tuning a phrase, there's a great deal of joy in that. So that's the poet's workshop, in a sense. And I don't see the workshopping of a poem in any way as different from that inspirational moment. I think Riyaz and Rasa, as I often say, go hand in hand. They go hand in hand. They're not separate. There is magic in the process of crafting a poem, So I think this impulse to see the two as separate, the magic and the manual labor as separate, is an unfortunate impulse. They're not separate.
I see. I get that. So again, poetry is very much rooted in the sensual world, in the material space, in how we are perceiving through our senses. So how does that connect with spirituality? Because you mentioned Bhakti poets, a lot of your writing has lately been a lot about spirituality. So how does the material side or the sensual side connect with spirituality?
I often say that I'm still writing about the same things that I wrote in my very first book of poems in 2001. It was called On Cleaning Bookshelves, and it had poems about cities, about relationships, about journeys, about life and loss and death and all of it. And I don't think I'm writing very differently today. I mean, the themes remain the same. The question really is how. The how has changed. And to me, that's the province of what you might call the spiritual. It is not about content. Really, it is not about content at all. We may choose to talk about sacred poetry and say, oh, this is talking about God, therefore it is spiritual. But in fact, we have a great deal of sacred poetry that doesn't even mention the notion of God. So it's not, I think there is often a misconception, and I'm guilty of this myself. When I embarked on a series of my own journey, really, and looked for a spiritual practice of my own, I was hoping that I would turn into some sort of wonderfully beatific and tranquil being. It would have been lovely. But what I discovered then is that a spiritual journey is not something that you can embark on with some little sliver in your cerebral cortex. The spiritual journey involves all of you. All of you, which means your own messy heart and your own very dense corporeal body, all of it is involved. So you can't really be a closet spiritual practitioner. It has to implicate all of you. So I think, unfortunately or fortunately, many of us believe that spiritual writing of any kind is about bypassing the body. In fact, it's not true at all. It's about inhabiting the self much more deeply than before.
I see.
I actually found a lot of my poetry, let me say this, a lot of the poetry in When God is a Traveler towards the end became deeply erotic. And that was actually a fallout, I imagine, of much more concerted practice and breath work.
Ah, so it's all connected, really.
Deeply, deeply, integrally.
So I would like to read out 2 lines from your latest book, and I think you'd written it in your earlier book as well. This is Goddess 2 after Linga Bhairavi. Okay. It's the last few lines in your new book, which we will discuss after this. Goddess 2 after Linga Bhairavi. In her burning rainforest, silence is so alive. You can hear listening. Beautiful. It was absolutely beautiful. To juxtapose a burning rainforest with silence that was so alive. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Shabani.
And
Thank you for reading that as well as you did.
my pleasure.
Mamta Nagpal wants you to read it again, Sharbani.
Okay. I do not mind, Mamta, reading it as many times. Goddess 2 after Linga Bhairavi. In her burning rainforest, silence is so alive. You can hear listening.
Thank you.
So we cannot leave you without a word about your latest book. And what is so interesting is, how did you really connect the dots from seekers, protagonists, goddesses, all the way to sacred poetry? How did that happen?
Good question. I think it started just with the fact that as a reader of all manner of sacred poetry, a question that I always had recurrently was, where are the women? And of course, there were a few women, a handful of them. There was, in the Indian context, there was Mirabai, there was Andal. Some of us knew of Akka Mahadevi and Lal Ded, but most of them had been sanctified to the point when it felt like one couldn't relate to them as individuals anymore. And I think part of this was about rescuing them from a kind of plaster sainthood. And the other part was actually about looking for women, looking for more and more women's voices, because women have certainly walked the path, walked it in a variety of ways. And I just felt the need to listen in, to reclaim those voices. So it was born of a very real thirst, Sharbani. And it became, however, a 5-year journey that drove me a bit crazy, because every time I felt I had a carefully curated list of poets, another poet would appear, and I would have to extend it that much more. And then another, and then another. So it started with about 25, and before I knew it, it was 56. And then I had to just call a halt to it, because I'm sure Penguin would have disowned me somewhere along the way if it had been indefinite expansion. But I think that's how it started. It just started with a deep thirst for women's voices. And I don't believe that this is just a thirst that is a female thirst. I think all of us, irrespective of our gender, long for a less lopsided and less skewed history. We all long for it. We want our ancestors to be plural. We want our ancestors to be male and female. I definitely wanted a legacy of strong female pioneers. I didn't want to just hear about seemingly spineless, crooning, sentimental songsters, which is how some of these figures had been presented to me, either as unattainable goddesses or else as I said, as beatified specimens. I didn't want either. I wanted a sense of realness. I wanted a sense of body as well as the beyond. Yeah, that's how it started.
So,
I think
yeah. So I hope to meet you in November, and I'll get you to sign this copy of Wild Women, which I'm still reading. It's absolutely fascinating because you're so right. I think everything comes together, from the sensual to the spiritual to the voices of women. And thank you for bringing us those beautiful voices and the voices of God and goddesses. Thank you so much.
I just want to say, Sharbani, that I wanted it to be a mix of voices. So the voices in there are the early Buddhists, the nuns of the Therigatha. There are voices of Vedantins, there are voices of Bhakti poets, but there are also the Sufi poets. And I wanted to say that because I think Shraddha has asked that question. I often mention that I wanted this particular book to have that kind of vibrant mix. So there's room for Piro, a 19th century courtesan of Lahore. There is room for Habba Khatun from Kashmir. There is Ma Lakabai Chanda. There are a whole host of women, from different persuasions, different orientations, because you can be of different religious backgrounds, but your orientation can be largely emotional. But it's not just that. I wanted the intellectual women, I wanted the deeply emotional women, I wanted the tantrikas who are really spiritual adepts. They're not really coming to this as bhaktas. They're coming to this as people who understand what the transformation of consciousness might entail. So I wanted that kind of mix. Shraddha, I hope you'll find I hope you'll pick up the book and find some of them in there.
So I would request Devdatta and Chetan to take you through the questions we've been receiving from our
Sure.
audience.
Hello. Hi,
Hello,
everyone.
Chetan.
Hi, Arundhati. How are you?
I'm well. Good to see you.
Yes, it's good to see myself because I was 2 minutes late, so I'm really sorry.
That's fine. That's fine.
All right, so we are going to take the questions. There's lots of questions in the chat, but before we go there, I just wanted to shoot a few questions at you, and you have to answer without thinking. Okay, so we're talking reflex answers here. So you have to answer with your reflex. Okay.
You're
First
doing
one,
a Karan Johar on me.
because it's going to be very hard for you to be politically correct. If you start thinking, that's not an option. Okay.
Oh,
So don't
okay.
worry about being politically correct. Just tell me the top of your head, what is the answer? First is, if the apocalypse was upon us today and the world was going to disintegrate and you had one poem, just one poem that you could save, which one would it be?
Mahabharata.
All right, great. If there was a single muse again that you had to choose, what would be, or who would be the muse that's kind of the one that always kind of comes around, delivers?
My goddess, Linga Bhairavi.
Lovely. The most important single piece of advice for budding poets. We have 65 of them now.
Oh. Read widely, revise, don't be in a hurry to arrive.
Oh, lovely. Don't be in a hurry to arrive. Awesome. Do you have a favorite funny poem? And if so, can you tell us which one that is?
Oh gosh, that's a tough one. Not a single one, but for now I'm going to choose Ogden Nash. A little talcum, no, a bit of talcum is always welcome. It's reflections on babies.
I have to check this out. A bit of talcum, I'm writing this down, sorry, is always
welcome.
Welcome. All right, that itself sounds good. And the last one, I think you already answered, but I'll ask you nonetheless, which has been the greatest Bhakti poet from ancient India in all your research in these 56. If there was one that touched you more than others, was there? I know that's an unfair question, but was there one? Could you pick one? Is that possible?
I'd say if there was a Bhakti poet who's rescued me, as I said earlier, it's probably been Nammalvar and the translations of Nammalvar, the Tamil saint by by A.K. Ramanujan in Hymns for the Drowning. That actually rescued me. But if I had to choose from this book, which is just women poets, I would say for today, for this morning, Sule Sankava, who is a courtesan poet in Kannada.
All right, awesome. Thank you so much. That's a lovely conversation. I'm going to move to all the questions now. We have a lot of questions in the chat, and some of them tend to be repetitive. So we'll start at the top. This is from Sumanya. She's saying, I understand the best way to appreciate poetry is to read more and more of it. But are there books you would suggest that would start us off on the process of appreciating poetry?
Books of poetry, does she mean?
Yes.
If so, yeah.
Or I think books that will help you become a better poet. Books that will help you appreciate poetry is what she's asking.
So that's from Sumanya, is it?
Yes.
Is that her name? Sumanya, I'd say that I'm sure there are such books, but I really, for me, an entry point has just been to read poems and to enter a bookshop. Once you start reading a fair amount, you enter a bookshop and you gravitate towards the poetry section and you allow your intuition to guide you. That's one way to start. The other is to read anthologies, because anthologies compile many poets into a single volume. And when you feel drawn to a particular poet, you might actually want to go and buy much more of her work or his work. And that's another way to do it. I found that Michael Schmidt's Lives of Poets, I found that fascinating because I'm interested in finding ways to enter the poetic universe of a single writer. So I found that interesting as well. But I'd say poems are the best way to poetry, you know. Read poems, and when you do, you will almost inevitably gravitate towards other kinds of commentary on that poet, on the poet you love. So I remember when I was fascinated by the Romantic poets, I remember reading more and more criticism. When I say criticism, I mean the critics who wrote on them. And so it deepens your love and excitement about them. And so I'd say one start is to pick up Wild Women. It has 56 crazy women, and you may want to pick up one and go deeper into that sort of exploration. So that's one possible way to approach it.
Great.
Yeah, someone says, Mamta says, letters to a young poet. That's true. Rilke is wonderful.
Yeah.
I think Rilke is a wonderful reminder not to be in a hurry. And I've said this before, I often think of poetry as a kind of dampucht utterance. It's meant to cook on a slow fire. And so you let that happen. You know, don't be in too much of a hurry to arrive. It's really about saying, don't push the pace. Poems need to cook in their own juices a little bit. So allow that to happen.
Right, great. Nina has an observation about magic and manual labor go together. So yes, I'll comment on that in the end. The next question is, after drafting a poem, is it important to workshop it a few times before considering it final? I sometimes notice that when it's written to capture a moment, relooking at it takes away from the moment. What are your thoughts?
Yeah, I think, who's the question from?
Shama
Shama.
Kuraikose.
Yeah, Kuriakos.
My apologies.
But I think, Shama, you're absolutely right. It's a very tricky balance, isn't it? Because you have to keep the heat and the intensity that drove you to write the poem in the first place. At the same time, you often find when you return to a poem that you need to cut off the flab. Now, how do you cut off the flab without sacrificing the poem itself, the kernel of the poem? This is the perennial challenge. I'd say to you, make sure you retain all your drafts. So even as you're chopping off stuff, each draft gives you a sense of your journey. I'm giving you advice that I don't necessarily keep myself, but what I do is I keep working on a poem, and if stuff gets knocked off the poem, I just make sure I hoard my favorite phrases in another file just for a rainy day. But you need to go back, I think, months later. In my case, I sometimes go back years later and look at the poem. And then if I feel it holds, irrespective of the fact that it may have happened 10 years ago when a moment was intense, but I need to look at it as a reader and feel that it holds and that there is a certain voltage in that utterance. If there is, I think that's the draft to keep.
Lovely. The next question is more about learning, almost academic poetry, but I'll read it out nonetheless. I struggle to understand how to judge modern poetry with blank verse, prose poetry, or poetry which breaks traditional syntax. How do I go about educating myself on how to judge and critique my own poetry in today's literary context? And how do I educate myself in poetics?
Who's that from?
This is from Shama, again the same. Yeah.
Shama again. Shama, I'd say, yes.
It's from
I'd say
me.
Shama.
Sorry,
Oh.
Swati, it's from me.
Okay, hello, Swati. Okay, Swati, it's a good question. I'd say to that, why is it that we find some kinds of poetry, what we call modern poetry, more difficult? There's a lovely line from Randall Jarrell, the American poet and critic, and he says that it's not that we've stopped reading modern poetry because we find it difficult. He says it's because we've stopped reading modern poetry that we find it difficult. So I don't think any of us really had a problem a lot of, when I first read Shelley or Keats, it's not like I understood every word, but I knew I enjoyed it. There was a pleasure in it. But it just so happened that we began to believe that was the only way poetry could be written because it came to us in school. Now let's believe that we were also reading, as some of us did, you were reading, say, Nissim Ezekiel in school, or you were reading Eunice D'Souza in school. Maybe your understanding of what poetry is or can be would already have expanded, have widened. So I'd say the best way to understand why you're drawn to something is to read more of it and to try and understand what resources the poet is using. Once you start analyzing that, you have a deeper appreciation of the whole project of poetry as undertaken by that poet. So a lot of what we do in our workshops at the masterclass that we have in November, which is coming up, a lot of what we do is to just look at what makes up a poem that excites us. What is it that goes into it? What are the ingredients? Looking at the ingredients, enjoying the ingredients without turning it into a soulless and anatomical exercise, but enjoying that, It's all part of one cauldron, and that's pleasurable to taste, but it's equally pleasurable to look at the ingredients of that cauldron.
Beautiful. Thank you. The next question is from our mutual friend Ram, Ramanjanaya. He was actually here for 3 weeks during the Emerging Writers Residency, so we spent a lot of time together. So his question is, the classical poetry had an emphasis on form and structure. Over time, the focus shifted towards individual expression, thought, and voice. Today, we see that a lot of poets have moved away from structure. However, your poetry has a rhythm and a musicality to it, a lay. Do you see a return to rhythm and musicality and maybe form? And the related question is, how important is form and structure to a greater extent rhythm and musicality to poetry? And can there be poetry without rhythm or musicality?
So Ram, I think the thing to remember is that, I see what your question is saying, but I'd also say that we think of structure often in a particular way. We feel that when language is organized in terms of meter, in English, maybe iambic pentameter. If we're reading another language, we may look for the meters of that language. We're often encouraged to see it in terms of those grids that we're familiar with. But in actuality, even free verse, which may seem like a lot of haphazard words on a page, in fact, has its own logic. The best free verse has its own logic. So how do you find the innate logic of a poem is the question. I'd say there is really no poem, no good poem without a structure. That to me is important to remember. There is no good poem without a structure. It may not have a structure that you immediately recognize. It may look like an amoeba. But you've got to find out if it works for you, why it works. And that's the exploration, really, about form. Because seeming free verse, seeming anarchy, often has an underlying form that needs to be investigated. So the best poems have that form.
Great. The next question, I think you've answered in parts. How do you find the input and motivation to write regularly?
I don't. I don't. I think it's not such a bad thing not to be writing all the time. I spend time around words because, that's my trade in a sense. I don't just write poetry. I do some amount of, I do articles. I read other people's poetry. I do prose. But I think with poetry, the good thing is the world is not falling over itself asking you to bring out your next book. And instead of mourning the fact, I'm kind of happy and grateful about it because it allows you to write at your own pace. If I was allowed to give the second bit of advice, Chetan, to younger writers, I'd say that write because you must. Don't ever allow poetry to turn tepid. Write because you really have to. It's wonderful to keep pushing the pen on paper and to sharpen your craft. For that reason, it's wonderful to make sure you're in touch with poetry. But before putting a poem out there, I think wait. There is really no hurry to do it. And make sure you have what my friend Guy Patel, the poet, often used to say. He was quoting Kandinsky. He said, make sure you wait for that moment of inner necessity. Otherwise, don't write.
Wow. All right. Awesome. Next question is from Tansi Troy. The question is, thank you for these wonderful insights. Your motivation to write poetry today is to make a line shimmer. It says to me that you need your poems to be printed and also read aloud and sounded out. Would you say this has to do with exploring a language which goes beyond words in any single language and speaks to those who have passed on or to the gods themselves?
Oh, Tansi, it's a good question. Yeah, I actually said to make a line shiver, but shimmer might do just as well.
Yeah, I thought that, but I wasn't sure.
Yeah, it was to make a line shiver on the page. I think, yes, on the one hand, there are so many ways we could understand this. It could be an offering to the gods, perhaps, or your understanding of what the gods are. Yeah, I think it's about if modern poetry readings could really be an offering to the gods, what an event they would be. What an event they would be. So for that, one doesn't need to necessarily be a believer in some kind of narrow sense of the term. It just means you're writing for and creating for what you think of as the ultimate for yourself, whatever that is for you. So I like the idea. I like the idea of the poem as a yajna, in a way, a kind of something that you put out there almost as you care for it deeply and put it out there. There's something that goes into that kind of utterance that is special. And I think I'm personally more interested now in the energetics of language, as it were. That is, what makes a line a high voltage utterance? What makes it different from just lukewarm speech? And that high voltage utterance doesn't always have to be portentous. It just means a line that aligns truth and beauty in a particular way in this particular moment for you. And then you gradually begin to trust it and to see where it leads you. That's a partial answer to your question, Tansi.
Thank you. Shraddha's question, she says, pleasure listening to you, but in the research for Wild Women, did you come across any women voices in the Sufi tradition, especially from South Asia?
I answered that earlier. Yeah.
Right. Swati, so it seems like a bunch of alums now. Swati, hi Swati. Looking forward to your insights and advice on prose writing too, your process, inspirations, and the secret to your prolific writing.
Swati, I don't know if you want, I don't write fiction. So I write only poetry and prose, yes, but not fiction. Prose, I mean, poetry, as I said, one does only because one must. Prose also, but I would say this is how I see it. I see prose as kind of opening a window to poetry. In many ways, that's how I see it. My last book, or the book before last, was called Women Who Wear Only Themselves. And it was essays alternating with poetry. And depending on who was asking the question, I would say to those who said, it's a book of essays, I would say yes, but it has poems interspersed as kind of palate cleansers. And for those who enjoy poetry, I would say really all those essays are invitations to read poetry. That's all it is. So it really depends on where one is coming from. For me, my primary love is poetry, but I enjoy the rigors of prose as well. The rigors of prose are different from the rigors of poetry. Both have their own strenuousness. Prose is more a horizontal exercise on the page and in terms of time. Poetry requires as much time and effort, but so much of the effort is about whittling down the utterance to its absolute essentials. So it's a different destination, but the journeys are not dissimilar. Though I think poetry is more a kind of lapidarist's exercise. You're working on crafting, it's like working on a jewel. And prose at its worst can be a kind of, I talked of manual labor, it can really be a kind of manual labor, carpentry. Those are the
Metaphors.
more muscular exercises that come to mind, but not entirely. There has to be room for expansiveness and intimacy in prose. And I like that dance.
All right. Ponu Elizabeth is asking any tips on for writing lyrical prose. That's been this whole session, but
Elizabeth asked that.
Ponu Elizabeth Matthew.
Okay. Tips, I don't know. I'd say tips to write lyrical prose. It's a tough one. I'd say this, make sure that you're not simply. I've been reading, okay, let me put it this way. I've been reading Keki Daruwala a lot in the past 2 days because he just passed away and he was a very dear friend. And what I realize I appreciate about his poetry is, on the one hand, it has this bird's eye view of the whole march of history and civilizations. And on the other hand, it has this great quality of particularity. So you remember this particular bird, a snow eagle that sits sedately in winged meditation on a tree. This sense of the big picture and the small picture, and to see that the two are inseparable. One is not more important than the other. The two go hand in hand, they're inextricable. This to me is just vital for all writing, that you don't create the hierarchies in your head. This is important, this is not important. You see it all as important. That's the gaze that you're trying to cultivate, where all of it is important in all its glorious, messy simultaneity. All of it.
Thank you. Soha has a very interesting question. She's saying, ma'am, you mentioned that some Bhakti poems saved you. Can you share a poem that can help beat self-doubt, or better yet, strengthen self-worth?
Oh, wow. Soha, that's a wonderful question. And, I'm not, this is not hard sell for Wild Women, but I would truly say that Wild Women happened because I think many of us, as women, I mean, everyone goes through this, but women have their own very particular brand of self-doubt that is often normalized by the cultures we live in. So to read of other women who grappled with those doubts and was still able to say, as Janabai, the 13th century mystic, did in a poem that I just read before we started this session, she's a maidservant. Think of that. She's a maidservant in the house of a celebrated poet, Namdev. And Janabai says, God, my darling, do me a favor and kill my mother-in-law, in one poem. In another, she says, I eat God, I drink God, I sleep on God. There's a kind of amazing self-possession that I find I find breathtaking, because it comes from women, not just like you and me, but women often who've had even fewer opportunities. So to me, self-doubt is often answered or addressed by reading women like this. When I read a Dalit woman mystic like Soirabai in the 14th century, who says, if menstrual blood makes me impure, tell me who wasn't born of that blood. Or if I read someone like Rupa Bhavani, the Kashmiri mystic of the 17th century, who says, on the path of Shiva, you become Shiva yourself. To me, these are astonishing voices, voices of such self-reclamation and power that you know that this journey couldn't have happened easily. So you start looking at what made it possible? What made it possible? And so there are poems of doubt, but there are also poems of great strength. And I think by listening to voices like that, that don't give you, it's not easy NGO poetry, if you know what I mean. It's not the poetry that's waving a flag because it's good to wave a flag and say, we must all be proud. This is a hard-won journey of self-reclamation. I think reading about those voices does a great deal for me.
Before the next question, I'm going to jump in here. And, I always, when I listen to you, Arundhati, I always say that it's incredible to listen to you. And I was trying to figure out why is it that I enjoy listening to you so much. And I think it's because of the words you choose. Like the way you used influence versus sanctuary, the way you used magic and manual labor, the way you used NGO poetry just now. I think it's almost like, even without, or sometimes using a metaphor, but often not even using a metaphor, you bring so much more meaning, make so much more meaning evident in the words that you use, that it's incredible. So I'm just so happy that you're coming in November. All right, I'm going to move to the next question. Seeing that the women you've spotlighted in Wild Women are those who have fallen through the cracks of history, what was your process in unearthing them? So the research.
Who's that? Who asked that
This
question?
is Srinidhi Ravi.
Srinidhi. Srinidhi, I think a lot of it was, as I said, I started with this manicured list and then realized how utterly naive I was in believing that I could proceed with that and make a book out of it, because the women just kept appearing. And I found, and this is true of everything, right? The more you start looking, the more they appear. I found women just toppling out of bookshelves in books, or I found footnotes that led me somewhere else. I started, I discovered, for instance, Jira Dei, a woman mystic in the tradition of Oriya Tantra, whom I would never have heard of if I hadn't had a chance conversation with a researcher named Pratik Patnaik. This is just to give you a random sense of how these things happen. Or if I hadn't met someone in Colorado who pointed out the work of Ma Lakabai Chanda, if I hadn't stumbled upon Osho's book on Dayabai, these were fortuitous, they were serendipitous. I'm glad they happened, but it also made the work seem interminable, So Srinidhi, I would say that a lot of it was a concerted research, spending time in libraries, ordering books, and which was not easy. I didn't have a grant during this project, but a lot of it was also this kind of uh, wonderful accident for which I was very grateful.
Right. Thank you for that. That was lovely. Sai has, I'm still looking for the question, is what she's shared, but I'll read it out and maybe you can just respond. Poetry has been part of lived experience, whether as children or adults. I don't think literature is exclusive for either. But in the last 30 to 50 years, when the written word or the culture of reading became more prevalent, poetry has not become part of people's lives. Therefore, reading poems has become niche. Poetry hasn't disappeared from our lives. How else would music and dance exist? So, but I don't know if there's a question there, but that's the observation.
It's true. She's right.
Right. Mangesh has a question. Can you suggest some books or poems which portray and tell about the hidden stories and events inside Indian Hindu mythology, or poems which express the Indian mythological heroes? Well, the poem she wanted to say was Mahabharata, but
Exactly.
but you
Whose
can
question
start
is
from there.
that?
Yeah.
Whose question is that?
This is Mangesh Shirke.
Hmm. Mangesh, yes, we can start right there. Or you can start with so many of there are a whole bunch of poets. I would look at, Kartika Nayar's book on the women in the Mahabharata. If you're looking for a recent book, that looks at some of these figures that we're all familiar with. I would say that's one possible place to start. In my book, When God is a Traveler, I have a whole cycle of poems on Shakuntala, who's also a character in the Mahabharata, later taken in by Kalidasa and featured there. But I think many of us are finding the need to look at archetypal figures. And so it's not so much about presenting the heroes of our time as much as looking at why some figures have entered our bloodstream. Why is it so difficult to rid ourselves of them? Why do we keep returning to them? I think those questions lead us to places we don't imagine. I never thought I would be writing about Shakuntala. When I started out, I was very determinedly a poet who wanted to write about, into inverted commas, the world that I live in. 546 Andheri Local, for instance, an old poem from my first book. That's the kind of thing I wanted to write about, the local train. I wanted to write about what it meant to be a woman in the city and so on. But then I found Shakuntala is also part of the world I live in. She's not separate. She's not back there. She's here. And it was when I began to discover that I realized what an archetype really means. An archetype is not something that happened back there in some golden age of our ancient culture, which is the way in which a particular kind of person likes to talk about civilization. To me, an archetype is what exists right now. The archetype is what you might uncover within yourself. That's the archetype. And if I have goddesses as part of my book, Wild Women, it is because I see those goddesses in many ways in terms of their radiance and their power. I see them here. I see them now. I don't see them as back then. So I found many mythic characters re-entering my poems for these reasons. The figure that I'm fascinated by currently, Mangesh, is the figure of Avvaiyar. She's the 8th century Tamil mystic. She's part legend. We don't really know much about her. But she fascinates me because she presents the archetype of the woman traveler. She walks. She's a mendicant. She's a poet. She's a vagabond. And she's a mystic. To me, that's paring her down to an essential power and radiance that I want to explore for myself.
Wonderful. Okay, we are down to like last 2-3 minutes, and I don't know how many of you are part of the book club, but Arundhati, just so you know, we started a new book club called it's a book club for writers. So that's going to kick in at 6 o'clock. But what we'll do is we'll take one last question and then we'll move out. And Dave might already head out and start that book club at 6 o'clock. I will catch up in 5 minutes. Okay, the last question which we're going to take is
Shraddha asks, what do you enjoy reading most outside of poetry?
let's go with that.
Oh gosh, I don't even know, Shraddha. Right now, my reading has become so tunnel visioned. What do I enjoy reading? I enjoy reading all kinds of. I enjoy reading biography. I enjoy reading strange kinds of spiritual literature. I say strange because those are not necessarily the titles I share with people. It's the kind of furtive reading I do for myself, Shraddha. But oh gosh, I will answer your question someday. More
right,
comprehensive.
Great. Thank you so much, Arundhati. It's been absolutely fantastic. We have more questions than we have time. But I'm sure that some of these folks will be able to catch up, and we'll have another opportunity at some point in time. Folks, you know the drill about FDC, but I'm going to take 2 minutes and talk about that. Arundhati, if you wanted to, leave
To
the
vanish.
now,
So if I,
you
before I,
want to, yes.
no, I'm
but-
happy to vanish and get myself more coffee, which is what I need at this point in the day. I just want to thank all of you who turned up, and I hope our paths will somehow intersect at some point in time. And thank you, Chetan. Thank you for making this happen. Sharbani, until November. Deb, thank you.
Thank you, Arundhati.
Thank
Thanks so
you.
much.
Thank you.
Thank
See you
you.
soon.
Soon.